So if anybody has questions, the best way to get them out is shoot them to me in the chat, and I'm going to call on people to actually ask those questions. So when you're asking the question, if you wouldn't mind unmuting your video and your audio, so that way we can actually see and hear you, and the panelists can chat with you. So I'll start with this. What questions do y'all have? Okay, so one of the first questions I got is, how did you all make such great demonstrative aids for your trial? They look so professional. What software were you using? Where do I get the software? So a couple questions related to the demonstrative aids. I'll start with Sonali, who just did the online competition and had really great demos in the final round.
Thanks. Sure, my second chair did most of it, but so yeah, if you watch the final round that I was in, the timelines, that kind of thing, that was just PowerPoint. And then some of the things we did with the exhibits, we like did on Photoshop, but then stuck it on a PowerPoint. So at least for us, the easiest thing was to use PowerPoint. It's easy to screen share and it just looks clean. We did sort of like a zooming thing on our PowerPoint, and like all of that, animating it, you can all do through PowerPoint. The only thing we did using Photoshop was just when we were like highlighting text off of an exhibit to like highlight a specific portion of the exhibit and then blur out the background. But I think you could probably do that on PowerPoint as well. I don't think you need Photoshop for any of it. So don't feel like you need to like buy any software or anything like that beyond PowerPoint. I think like pretty much everything you need is right there, and it has a lot of features. So, you know, if you want some practice, like get comfortable with it beforehand, or have your second chair get comfortable with, you know, like what does it look like to highlight text? Like, how do I do that really quickly? That's what I think my second chair did really well, was mid-round, if I was like, hey, I need this part of the exhibit highlighted for this cross that I'm gonna do in 30 seconds, he could have it ready that fast. And that was really useful.
Liz, I thought your advocate had really great demos at Top Gun. What software, what system did you all use?
Yeah, so thank you, Justin. And I feel like Top Gun, I think you all are probably mock trial geeks like I am. So you all are aware of Top Gun. It's kind of like my nemesis. I can't make the cut. And that's where I first met Justin. And I appreciate you for that compliment. But when I was preparing this year in particular, I realized that in an online format, the judges need to see something, right? Like you can't just be watching a screen for 3 hours because they're going to get super bored. So immediately when we were preparing ahead of time, I realized that we need to have some kind of a visual. So during everything, opening statement, cross, direct, etc., we had some kind of a PowerPoint, and that's the platform that we use. Normally Top Gun allows us a license to like a trial director, I forget, trial queue or something like that. But literally we just used PowerPoint, and it has everything that you need as long as you share screen. So truly, as Sonali just said, PowerPoint.
So I want to flip it over to Abby for a second, because she's the only person on screen who's been a second chair. What advice do you have for those who are second chairs at the end of the month about how much to use the demonstrative aids and how to approach them from the perspective of somebody who just did second chair?
Yeah, so I would say, I would echo what the other panelists have said. I would practice a lot with Zoom beforehand. I would practice with the video. I don't know if you guys have videos. I know we did for TBC. If there are videos involved, to make sure the audio works on those correctly, and you know how to screen share those so that they look clean. I would echo what Sonali said. PowerPoint is great and it's very easy to work with, but just practice a lot beforehand. You have the advantage of having, you know, the 30 days leading up to it to just practice with Zoom because it is so unique. So I would say that, and then I would also say I agree to try to input demonstratives and visuals in your statements, in your crosses, in your directs, really anywhere that you can, and just make it look so professional so that you can keep those scoring judges engaged.
Justin, if I may, too, you experienced this when you were doing it as second chair, doing the technology, and I think it's the hot spot for sure. Make sure that when you are share screening with any kind of video or audio, there's a box when you hit share screen that tells you, like, you have to click the box to make sure that the sound is on. So just make sure that your second chairs know that ahead of time, so you guys don't run into that situation where it's like, the sound's not working, because nobody likes those awkward moments.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. So this question's we'll start with Tom. How do you deal with exhibit lag? Making sure you get the exhibits up on the screen as fast as possible.
So I think Gladiator affords people the opportunity, certainly when it comes to opening and components of closing and directs, to have that really worked out and where you can test it with time with your second chair and ensure that you have a sense of what that lag really is. I think one of the things we did at Trial by Combat this year was really focus on making sure we had that extra beat between sort of the moment of share and then the next round of speaking in case there was any degree of that lag. But I think you can test for it. The other thing is just about your second chair knowing the material and knowing what you're going to need. So they need to not only have a breadth of knowledge of the case, but a breadth of knowledge of what you're going after and the kinds of things that you may be moving in and out on. And that has to do with the work that you put in with them in advance more than anything.
That's great. Abby, how did you make sure you got your exhibits up on screen fast?
We practice beforehand with putting up the demonstratives on the screen. And I will add too, one thing that I think goes a long way with judges is, you know, the Zoom format is very unique. The situation we're all in is very unique. So I think it goes a long way if you do have technical difficulties to just own it and be natural, and don't be afraid to not take yourself so seriously in those moments, because it can be, you know, a little bit awkward with the Zoom format. But I think, you know, if there is a moment where the demonstrative is not up, you know, perfectly on time, or the audio is not working, to just laugh it off and say, you know, Your Honor, if you'll just give us one moment, we're having some technical difficulties. I'm sure they will be very understanding of that. We saw that a lot in TVC. But to answer your question, I would say just prepare ahead of time. You have the advantage of the 30 days. So just practice Zoom, you know, with your second chair. I think that would be the best advice I could give.
You mentioned technical difficulties. And so I'm going to ask a question of Sonali in a second, because I've gotten a couple of questions from people. What do we do if something goes wrong? Can we still be competitive? And I think Sonali can tell you a little bit about that.
For sure. Yeah, I was gonna say it, and then Abby beat me to it. So when I was competing at TVC during my semifinal round, Mr. Fessman, the person I was, you know, competing against, is closing, giving this great close, and it starts thundering outside my house, and I'm like, like I live sort of in the middle of nowhere. I knew it was gonna be bad, and 2 minutes later, my power goes off. You hear my dad in the other room yell. My second chair is freaking, like we're all freaking out. And I'm trying to get it up on my phone when Justin calls me, and I'm like, I can't talk to you, I'm doing it on my phone. Anyways, the power came back in a few minutes, and I came back into the room, and I was like, I'm sorry, like I missed most of the closing, took a second, went ahead to the closing, it was fine. I think Abby's like completely on in that, like, expect things to go wrong, don't expect everything to be perfect, you never know, the power could go out, and it could be more simple things, right? Like the sound isn't working, or the demonstrative doesn't come up as fast as you want it to, and you know, in those moments, you have a chance to be personable and to have this connection with the judge where you're like, you know, I'm sorry, Your Honor, just give us a moment, smile, be nice, be a normal person, you know, instead of like being stiff and being really serious. And I think that goes a really long way and helps you with the substantive part of it, because that's part of like having this rapport and this relationship with the judge that the jury is watching. So yeah.
Justin, can I add to that real quick? So I think one of the things that you lose in the competition when it's online is the ability to engage and interact in more of that one-on-one sort of personal dynamic with judges, or even certainly with jury where their video is muted, right? And that change means that you're not able to see the facial reactions, you're not able to gauge some of those things. So we all talk about trying to be human in the courtroom, right? And those moments where your opposing counsel sneezes and you say, bless you, or you hand somebody a tissue, or whatever those silly moments are that are the non-scripted, beautiful, engaging moments. Technical difficulties are your opportunity to do that in this competition, because they're going to happen. And that doesn't mean that you need to on repeat indicate that you're having technical difficulties or it's a little bit of lag, but when something really does go wrong, just own it and live that and be a part of it, because that is the equivalent of the handing someone a tissue moment in this kind of a digital format.
And can I just, Justin, if I may, Thom, you're my new mock trial god, by the way. I think I love you. Because if you don't address the fact that there is a technical difficulty, then it's like this weird moment where everybody that's watching it is like, okay, so obviously this advocate has some stuff going on, and this other person's just going to continue like it's like there's no big deal. Like, I actually think that it's better than the sneeze moment where you can offer a tissue, because it's like, okay, let's make sure that witness heard it, or let's make sure that the advocate has their Wi-Fi back up, whatever it is. If you don't address it, I actually think you seem so much more robotic, and it just seems silly. So I definitely think that that is one thing that you guys can almost like take advantage of, like use that moment to have the situation where we normally would in person, to be able to liken yourself to the jury and be more human. If things happen with any kind of technology, take advantage of it, in my opinion.
So Sonali had this great moment. She told you when she got knocked out and she had to come back in, before she started her closing, she said something like, "I apologize, Mr. Bestman, I'm not gonna be able to respond to your closing because I didn't get to hear it." And that's such a clever way of addressing the fact that they all know she can't be responsive. But it's also clever because she's saying, "Hey, judges, don't score me down for not being responsive. I wasn't here." Really, really smart and personable and thoughtful in the moment without being, but she never said, "Oh, my power went out, woe is me." And so she really kept her calm and was really strategic. I thought that was great. So we have a great question from Theodora about improving aspects of your performance. Theodora, would you pop on screen so we can hear your question?
Hi. So I asked if you could improve any single aspect of your performance. So cross control, like emotion during closing, etc. What would it be?
Let's start with Sonali.
Do you mean just in general, or I guess, Okay, I think
it's hard for Sonali since she won and beat everybody, but she's going to try her best.
Don't say that. Okay, I think, well, I'm just thinking about my final round in particular, because obviously that's the most recent thing that I did, and which I gave, honestly, quite a poor opening. I think, like, part of it is I think, like, especially at the beginning of online trials, this sounds dumb, but, like, lighting and setup and those things matter, and I had a pretty bad setup, so don't look at mine if you're trying to figure out how to do it. I was relying on my window for light, and then a storm came, and so I had no light in my room anymore. Anyways, but I think, like, yeah, I think that, I was sort of relying on just like doing a clean opening like I would do normally, and it didn't really, like, just wasn't enough in this format. Maybe I like should have put a demo, like a picture or something, and yeah, I don't know. I think, like, I played it a little safe on the statement in the final round, so that's what I would say, I think.
Tom, what would you do differently? Because Tom's student did great. She was number 6 overall. He's had students win these competitions. But looking back at your recent ones, even when you've done well, what would you try to do even better?
Yeah. So I'll talk about this one with TBC in particular. I think and I know I'm not going to get into the specifics of the case, but I think one of the things that was really notable was on one side versus the other. Am I good to do this without getting into any specifics, Justin, is all, if I keep it vague like this? Okay. So on one side, we set out what I would describe as a wildly clear structure that allowed us to really come back to that over and over again in a way that our sort of the other flip of it didn't happen that way at all. And I felt good about the theory on both sides, but one of them, I think we went really above and beyond on knowing that it was going to be online, knowing that we weren't going to be able to, for example, physically spot locations for people to remember the things that we were talking about in rooms, or even draw distinctions where one of the things that's funky about online competitions is we're all used to pointing at defendants and things, and that's out the window in a competition like this. And so without those kind of components, I think we should have looked on one of our sides at creating a much more direct structure in our arguments that the room could track easier. And I think on the other side, we did that really well by saying, hey, keep it simple. It's online. People are trying to follow along. It's a lot that's happening in a case they're unfamiliar with, and they don't even have the cues in a room that you would normally have that you're able to remember from. So I think that's probably what my biggest one was. It would be this overarching idea of it. I will add one other quickly, which is that I think I have jealousy of Sonali's Zoom function, a lot of jealousy of it. And what makes this worse is that I saw it in advance. So we scrimmaged. Sonali was part of a 4-person scrimmage that we did that involved my student, and we saw it. And in the moment we saw it, our whole room said something along the lines of, "Oh," at her Zoom feature. And it was so cool. And I think what it speaks to is that your leader exhibit used to be pervasive throughout the trial. You need it everywhere so that people are engaged. But remember, it's a checkbox. So it's not just the engagement throughout, it's big moments. And her Zoom on what is essentially a super demo in that final round is just baller. Like, that's the kind of moment people remember. And I should have taken the lesson when I saw it the first time and stolen it, and I didn't, and I regret that.
Tom, when you say zoom, you mean zooming in, like enlarging it?
Oh, if you go watch the final, I think it is the final, she has a timeline demo and it moves and she clicks it and it like, you whoosh in on her demo. It's so cool. And the thing about moments like that, and I say this to the whole field, is that you're looking for moments. These rounds are so tight and every one of you is so good that you're looking for moments where it doesn't have to be piecemeal added over the course of the trial. People can look at a moment and say, okay, they both used exhibits a lot, but oh, that girl Sonali, she had that crazy Zoom feature. I give her the checkbox. And you need to be thoughtful about those kind of dynamics. And I think I could have learned a better lesson from you, Sonali, in that scrimmage, frankly.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, Sonali. So I'm going to ask everybody who's not on the panel if you could just turn off your video so that way we can see our panelists. Go ahead, Sonali.
Yeah, I was just gonna say thank you. That was very nice. I think that our thought process behind that was, doing it online, you have the opportunity to do any sort of demonstrative that you want. If you wanted to put up every single word of what you're saying, you could. But our thought was, instead of doing things that feel like you would never bring them in a courtroom to begin with, bring the kind of things that you would put in a courtroom, like a timeline, and then elevate it with the online features. And I think people have different ideas about this. Like, you could put like the text of your theme or whatever on the screen. And I think that's a fine way to go about it. But our kind of philosophy was, what would we do normally, and then how can we make it more interesting? And so that's where the moving timeline came from.
Listen, I'm sorry if I can ask you a question real quick, because I'm experienced to this awesome competition. So what is the view and the vantage point of the judges? Are they going to look at what we're looking at right now, or are you going to be training them that they're only going to be seeing the advocates?
So it's the same as Top Gun, but we're going to tell them that they should use side-by-side mode for exhibits. We're going to encourage them to use the gallery view for examinations and the speaker view for speeches.
And so the only people that are going to be in the Zoom room, it's not like right now where you have 34 participants in here, because right now I would ask everybody to hide non-video participants, for example.
Right.
I'm going to need to go through that. So it's going to be a smaller screen view. Okay.
Yeah, that's part of our judge training.
I didn't get the opportunity to see Sonali's magical timeline thing, but I highly recommend it, and I'm all for it. So that you guys can, you just need to have, I always call it the shiny red thing, right? You need to just make sure that you have the shiny red thing in the corner where somebody can look at and be distracted, because if they're listening to you for a lengthy period of time, they're just not going to pay attention anymore. And to that point too, I would say, again, we didn't win Top Gun or whatever, but I think you need to really shorten the amount of your presentation. So nobody wants to hear a 10-minute opening anymore in an online format, even in the real world. Nobody wants to hear a 30-minute direct or a 30-minute cross. If you just really need to cut the fat and truly get to the things that matter so that people can actually pay attention and there's that wow moment.
Anna had a question. Anna Claypool, go ahead.
Hi. So basically, I think my question was mainly about objections, I guess, in regards to evidence, because I know they're all pre-admitted, and I was just kind of confused on that. I was running through one of my directs with my coach, and we had the interview with Miss Bassett, and we were like, Kara said this and blah blah blah. And then we were like, wait, isn't that hearsay? Or isn't that speculation? And we were like, are we allowed to object because this is already admitted? And we were just kind of confused on that.
I should probably take this one since it's case specific. So I don't think the Kara Bassett interview is pre-admitted, right? That's exhibit 3. So I don't think that's one of the pre-admitted exhibits. But
okay.
If you are talking about a pre-admitted exhibit, then you can't object to the content. You could, I suppose, object to the way it's being used if you think that it's being displayed in a way that's misleading. But that's going to be a pretty tough argument to make about a document that's already in evidence that you could display yourself and point out to the other side. So the purpose behind those was to let everybody focus on using the material rather than laying a foundation and eating up all of your time on screen. So I think your best bet on exhibits 4 through 33, find ways to attack them, not try to exclude them, because they're not coming in, they're already in. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anna.
Oh, and then I had a follow-up question
go
about
for it.
like getting them in. So do we even have to lay foundation, or can we literally just say like, I'm getting what's previously entered as exhibit 5. Do you recognize this? Blah, blah, blah.
If the witness already knows it, you don't even have to do that. I mean, for example, if Abby were my witness and Sonali were my second chair, I would say, Ms. Branham, are you familiar with, actually she is Ms. Branham, she's the agent, I forgot it. So Agent Branham, are you familiar with the defendant's power of attorney?
Yes, I am.
Ms. Mehta, could you throw that up on the screen? And then Sonali throws it up on the screen. I say, Your Honor, for the record, this is exhibit 31. It's already admitted. That way the judge knows you're not throwing something on the screen that you don't have permission to put on the screen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Liz, any additional thoughts on that?
No, I do, because in the real world, not the mock world. So I train a lot of court systems how to handle like adapting to online court hearings. And what a lot of judges are expecting out of attorneys is the request. So it's, Your Honor, may I please have the opportunity to share screen? So if you guys actually tried to share a screen right now, I did it earlier, Justin's very smart. If you click on the green button at the bottom that says share screen, he has disabled that. So a lot of court systems are actually disabling that so that people that are in the Zoom room don't, share their screen, because God forbid we could get Zoom bombed. So part of like the respect of the court is to say, Your Honor, may I have permission to share screen? So that's one way that I would also think that a lot of judges and real practitioners are handling that right now.
Yeah. I can't remember.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
On objections in particular, just sort of inspired by the question. I think one of the things that happens in particular in high school mock, and especially when you're at the caliber that this group is that you score a lot of points in your everyday county or regional or state competitions against lesser teams on what can be technical objections or even sometimes petty objections, but other people don't know how to handle them. And in a competition like this, the caliber is much higher. And when you pair that with the online competition, it means it's very easy to cross the line into what feels annoying and disruptive over small things versus building credibility to really articulate bigger arguments when you need them. And I suppose I'd love, like, Sonali, your sort of insight in this as a competitor from the standpoint of the online competition. I found it while watching rounds to be so disruptive when people were almost hyper objecting in a way that I felt even more bothered by it than I think I would even in a Gladiator top level semi or a final or whatnot.
Yeah, my coach's philosophy, I should say, usually about objections is pretty much object whenever you can, because you have the potential to not only like get your objection score, but also like mess up whatever they're doing, right? But yeah, I think you're right in that that's a little bit less true in Zoom, just because it's every time an objection happens, it's more disruptive than in real life, because they have to stop talking. Everyone's like, oh, there was an objection, and it takes a moment for everyone to like recalibrate to what's going on. That doesn't mean don't do them. I think like especially clever ones that people may not have seen coming, or ones that are just really necessary if someone's trying to bring something in that's just blatantly, not acceptable. But I think that's right about some of maybe the lower level things that you might do, like foundation, or even like, especially with the exhibits being pre-admitted, like some things that you might think to do that, the other person can probably handle, like may not be worth doing.
Emily Akins, do you want to pop on our screen and ask the question you sent me?
Sure. So I'm wondering about impeachment by omission. It seems like it would be awkward for the attorney to project the exhibit and just scroll through it for the witness on the screen. But at the same time, I feel like it would also be awkward for the witness just to sit there in silence while the attorney sits there in silence, and the judges do as well, while he or she is scrolling or flipping through that exhibit on paper. So how do you think we should handle that?
Liz?
Thanks, Justin. are you providing to the witnesses like a bookmarked or like, okay. So
yeah, all the judges have an electronic notebook, and all of the witnesses are also competitors. So Emily, for example, is going to have 4 rounds. She's going to be a prosecutor, a defense attorney, prosecution witness, and a defense witness. So all of the witnesses already know the materials, and they have the materials.
And if they have the materials, Emily, the way that I would handle it is just say, you know, this is the first time that do the whole litany that you're going to do with regard to the impeachment, as far as the commitment of the statement that was not in the prior deposition, and then go ahead and look at your exhibit. And then you have to kind of wait a moment because it's technology. You can see that they're pulling it up. Go ahead and scroll through the portion of your deposition. And I would always, even in a real courtroom, like a brick and mortar courtroom, I would always point to them where it would naturally occur. So for example, if there's a part on page 3 where they would naturally talk about whether the light was red or green in a car accident, I would say, go ahead and look at page 3, the 3rd paragraph. That's where you talk about the lights. Nowhere in there do you say blah, 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 right? So you just kind of, it's the same thing, but you have to assume that they're on a computer, and you just kind of have to wait for the lag where they pull it up, and you direct them to the portion of the deposition where they talk about it, and then handle it that way. I don't know. Tom's my new mock trial god, so he might have an awesome other explanation.
No, I think everybody needs to do their own thing to a certain extent. It's more about control in what is a high lag environment. And because everybody is competitors who know it, you can lean on things like you've got that digital notebook in front of you and you're familiar, where you can almost get up further in it with the witness in their discussing of what they know before you actually get to a point of having to awkwardly, for example, scroll through some lengthy document, but rather be in full control where you're still the lead on screen before you then engage in some form of a screen share where you're doing zooms on the section it ought to have been in or something. And so I very sort of in general on an omission, like keep it on you and try to keep the control during that process, because the minute you start giving it to a witness who's lagging on that response, everybody's operating on very, very, very tight timelines in terms of time limits in a competition like this. And so you can lose a minute or two with the witness who's just being vaguely non-responsive for you, and all of a sudden your cross becomes all about that kind of messy technological situation.
Yeah, and I gotta
look like you. Go ahead.
If anything I said didn't like convey this, you should never put it up on the share screen. If it's an impeachment by omission, like you should just have the witness open it up on their own computer and be like, hey, look at page 3. This is the section where you would have talked about XYZ. Nowhere in there do you say Z. So like, I don't think that if it's an impeachment by omission, you should ever do a share screen scroll thing. Like it should just be you questioning about it. If there is an impeachment, like it's a prior inconsistent statement, that's a whole different ballgame. And I actually think that ballgame is fun on Zoom because you can actually show the impeachment by prior inconsistent statement by share screen, but I would never do it by an omission.
Thanks, Emily. I will add before we go to our next question that while it's a great question Emily asked about impeachment by omission, we don't have to worry about it because I know none of you are going to invent any material facts, right? Right. Okay. Sam Farnsworth, can I get you to join us on screen?
Hi, everybody.
Sam's our first gladiator from New Hampshire. Go ahead, Sam.
First, thank you all for taking the time to answer these questions. I have 2, actually. The first is, were the students or coaches ever worried that the exhibits would distract judges from the competitor's performance? And the second was, does the panel have any advice for choosing a background for Zoom?
So let's start with the question of, can you have too many demonstrative aids? We'll start with Abby, who is actually displaying the demos. Did any judge tell you you used too many exhibits?
No, we did not get that comment at all. I think obviously if you just have demos up the entire time, especially if they are obviously unnecessary, that could be a little bit distracting. Of course, you want them to be focused on your performance and what you're saying. But honestly, in just the experience that I had watching TVC, I did not see one round where I felt that too many demonstratives were used by any of the competitors. I don't know if you guys have access to Sonali's final round, but I would echo everything that was said about hers being fantastic.
Yeah, they all have the final round, yeah.
I would say absolutely take notes and defer to everything that she did. I think it was pretty fantastic. on that.
Sonali, how many judges told you that you or your opponent used too many exhibits?
Okay, so no one said you used too many exhibits, but I do think that we really intentionally tried to make sure it wasn't too much. I think that there is a balance there, just because you still want to have your moments where you're the only person on screen and you sound really good saying a thing. You know, like there's specific times in my close that, you know, like the example I can think of is like a time in my close where we could have had the exhibit I was sort of talking about up on the screen, but we knew that the point I was making and the way I was saying it was important, and so we wanted it to just be me on screen. So I think like pick your moments to do that, and especially in closing is the place to do it. To have like a moment where it's just you and you're proving what a presenter that you are. Yeah, that being said, obviously I use a lot of exhibits, so don't be shy to use them. But I do think that like going overboard is a thing, and you want to think about that balance and making sure you're giving yourself the space to shine.
Yeah, I'll tell you, having watched some of these trials and coached at Top Gun, I don't think I ever saw somebody use too much. And I'll give you sort of one case-specific tip. If you're talking about tranquilizers, use the tranquilizers. Or if you're talking about the logbook, throw up the logbook. I mean, you have dozens of exhibits. Some of the judges will not have read the case. They want to see this stuff. And if they're viewing it as we've asked them in side-by-side mode, you can literally gesture to it. So I think you got a lot of weapons there. Sam had a second question. Sam, will you remind us what it was?
I think it was about the background, yeah?
Yes, exactly. You all have any advice for choosing a Zoom background?
So much advice, Sam. So let me just tell you this. So Justin, do you guys have a rule against any kind of virtual background screened? Or, all right, so here's the deal. For Top Gun, again, I full disclosure, we didn't make the cut, I didn't win, whatever. But we were not allowed to use virtual background screens, which I understand because a lot of computers don't actually allow, I had computers before this newer one that I wouldn't be able to have a virtual background screen on, or if I didn't have a green screen, it wouldn't work. So it makes sense to have a level playing field that the Top Gun competition would not allow us to do it. But then, you know, I'm on Zoom with my advocate, and he's got this terrible background, like of a bedroom that has literally like lights on the ceiling. And I'm like, oh my God, Austin, like we're not in a disco bar for a mock trial competition. So I spent hours upon hours with that man, like making sure that his background looked awesome, right? Like he had the perfect bookshelf and books and everything else. And then as it turns out, Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, the winner of the competition had the worst video camera footage that I've ever seen in my life. Like it almost looked like she ran into a building and saw security footage camera and was like, oh, that'll do. Because like when she was sitting, you couldn't even see her. When she was standing, she was so tiny in this big courtroom. Which boils down to my answer to you, Sam, is that I have no idea what's going to work in an online competition. And what I can tell you is that the same thing that I tell any advocates in a brick and mortar competition, I just think that the goal is to not conflict or like detract from anything that you're saying. So like if there's something that's behind you that's distracting, then that's a bad thing. If there's something that they're going to look at and they're going to be like, oh, what is that in your backgrounds? Then that means they're not listening to what you're saying on behalf of your client or in the case. So even though the whole Top Gun thing totally blew my whole theory like out the window as far as like a background, my big picture thing that I'm thinking with regard to any kind of virtual background or real background as far as what it should look like, I think it still boils down to your advocacy.
Yeah, so I'll just add this. I think we all would encourage people to try to think carefully about what your background is going to be. You want the cleanest possible background. For example, when my competitor was at Top Gun, she was here, but we took the paintings off the wall. So that way all they had was the gray wall behind her. It doesn't matter whether you have something beautiful or simple. I think the point is you just do the best you can with it. And what we saw in both final rounds is that sometimes it's really just about the advocacy. Sonali was fantastic. I would not model your background after Sonali's setup, but I don't say that to her as an insult. I think it's an example of the fact that a fantastic competitor is a fantastic competitor. The woman who won Top Gun was not in an ideal setting, as Liz pointed out, but didn't matter. She was the best advocate and she won. So I think you want to do the best you can, but don't feel like the person with the best background is necessarily going to get the best score. Sam, thanks for the question. I'm going to ask to jump on screen Talia Vukotic from La Jolla in San Diego. Hey, Talia.
Hi, thank you guys for being here. My question's about sitting and standing, and I understand that's a personal preference, but I was just wondering what worked best for you, and why you decided to do what you did in terms of sitting and standing and when.
So we'll start with Thom and then go to Sonali.
Yeah, so we had our student obviously sitting as a witness the whole time, which I think is required. For attorneying, we worked really hard on creating a setup that allowed her to stand without losing distance in effect. And that's something that happened over the course of the weekend, really. We actually improved on it a lot as the rounds went on, where I think we initially started on this idea that we wanted her at a distance where you could get full range of, for example, arms, and it was cut at sort of thigh level of sorts for her. And we kept getting feedback that she felt far away, or that people were liking things slightly more zoomed in. So we kept kind of retweaking the layout of our room to allow her to be able to stand without it looking weird and disruptive, and also that where she could effectively be standing and still be close enough that you were getting very clear facial expressions from her on camera. I think what you want to do as an advocate is you want to preserve your ability to use every tool that you have. And that means being physical without being really far away from camera, where eventually, as a result, nobody is getting what is your facial expressions. And so you've got to balance the two, would be my advice. But I think it also is very much a personal thing. I know, and as you jump to Sonali here, Sonali in her semifinal had a round against a man named Matt Besman of Ohio State. And Matt did his whole round that I saw at one point in the competition seated, and it was great. And he was fantastic seated the whole time. And I think more than anything, it's about the individual people and what they're most comfortable with. And as long as you're kind of selling whatever you're most comfortable with and you're using the tools in your tool belt, seems to me that it's working out just fine for folks.
Sonali?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think like being comfortable is important. That said, like for me, obviously coming from doing a lot of mock trial in person, being like what felt most comfortable was to stand. So I stood for everything except if I was objecting to something that the other person was doing. So I was objecting to their direct or their cross, I would stay seated just in front of my computer, but everything else I was standing. Only tweak I might make is maybe staying seated for direct and staying closer. That way it's like more of a focus on the witness. We didn't really think about that, but looking back, that might be a change I make. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think like for me, it definitely made more sense to stand for speeches and for cross because, you know, you, like Thom was saying, like you use those tools in your toolbox. You can move around and be more dynamic versus just sitting here on the screen and not being able to move as much. So yeah, that's what worked for me.
Justin, if I may.
Yeah, go for it.
I know you want to scoot on to the last couple of questions. There's nothing wrong, I don't think, Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, with any kind of pretrial, like housekeeping matters or procedural issues. I mean, asking the judge what his or her preference is. And, you know, in the real world, here's what I think is weird about like a Zoom mock trial competition. Like in the real world, which is happening, where people are trying cases online, it's not jury trials, except for Texas, God bless y'all, Texas. People aren't standing up, right? So like to me, when I was prepping my Top Gun competitor, it was weird to tell him to like stand up for certain things because I'm like, nobody in the real world in actual court is standing up for a speech versus a direct or a cross. But in these competitions, like these judges also are kind of new to this format. So I don't think there's anything wrong with asking what the preference is, unless I'm wrong. Justin, you can tell me that I'm wrong.
No, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking. I think the danger is you're going to get an answer from the presiding judge, and you're not going to know what the scorers are going to think. So
Agreed.
You may be misled, right? So
at least
yeah.
Judge once.
Right. But my preference in general is, I always tell my advocates, don't ask the judge's preference. Ask them if what you want to do is acceptable, because they're usually going to say yes, and then you're more likely to get to do what you want. But I think that's a stylistic thing.
So with what I ended up doing with Top Gun is I had Austin do his speeches standing and then his questioning sitting. I don't know if I hated it in the end run or if I loved it. It's something that you guys need to all kind of figure out. But again, depending on what the judges are doing or what the scoring judges are doing, like in the real world, I don't think that people who are trying cases on Zoom are necessarily standing up for things.
Thanks, Talia. Linnea F. Stewart, can we have you join us on screen?
Hi, yeah, thank you for being here. My question is, what kind of camera did the committee position it to show their body language? Shoot.
So what kind of camera do you use to show your body language? Tom, would you take this one, and then Abby?
Yeah, I think so everybody's setup I know is different here. My advice, even separate from answering your question directly, is test it. Test it, test your setup, test it in advance. And don't just test it, by the way, in person alone. Test it and get somebody on the other end of a Zoom line in another room where they're isolated on the sound, and they can watch and they can hear you, and they can comment through Zoom at what they like and what they don't like, and that they think you should be, for example, closer, further away, less dead center. Like test, 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 test. What we used was essentially a one of the matte, like big retina displays, and it had a camera baked in that we found to be high quality, and then we had a laptop connected to it that had all of the other files, and then another laptop that was the second chair's laptop happening on the side, and then we had a mic and lighting and all sorts of stuff. I don't think that matters as much as testing it and feeling good about it.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Tom said. I think just along the lines of testing it, if you have a second chair that's willing to help you do this, maybe putting up, I know what we did in preparation for trial by combat was we had my computer up, and then we had Taylor's computer in another room, and I would videotape actually while she was practicing her statements and directs what the screen looked like, so that she could watch herself doing what she was doing, and she could critique herself and figure out what she liked and what looked weird to her, so that when she actually went to compete, she could change those things. But as far as the camera goes, we just used laptop cameras just in a courtroom. So I think really anything can work for sure.
Awesome. So we're going to take 2 more questions to the group, and then I'm going to ask a specific question to each of you. So if I could get Elena Young to join us on screen. So Elena is not really here to ask a question. She just wants to intimidate everybody. She was last year's runner-up. She's gunning for it this year. Elena, what's your question?
Oh my gosh. Thank you guys all for being here. I really appreciate you guys answering our questions. My question was if you guys have a preference on whether or not our second chair should be physically in the same room with us, or is it more beneficial to have them in a separate room?
Liz and Sonali?
I think what I'm going to say might be different than what you're about to hear next. So at Top Gun, I was literally the one of 3 teams out of what, Justin, 12, 16 that we have there, truly socially distancing. Like I had a student in Florida, I had a student in DC, and then I was in Virginia. I can't say whether it's beneficial or not, to be honest with you, as a coach and somebody who's been doing this for way too long and in denial of how old I am. My bigger concern is if everybody's in the same room, whether or not they're actually cheating and whispering and saying things and blah, blah, blah. I can't say whether there's a benefit to having somebody in the same room or not. Since you guys are providing your own witnesses, I think it's going to be a little bit different than what we experienced at Top Gun. Justin, I'm sorry, and I see you keep muting and unmuting, so please chime in.
Oh, no, you're fine.
So with regard to, having you as the advocate in the same room as the witness, here's my technology side that I think is going to kick in. You're going to have some feedback that I think is actually going to be a detriment. So unless you want to actually communicate with them in the same room, and Sonali and Abby can probably talk to the fact because they were competing in the same building or whatever, because we're recording each other, I actually think you're going to see some technology feedback and like bad sound situations if they're actually in the same room. So if Abby or Sonali could chime in on that end.
Sonali?
Yeah. So I actually, like during my TVC prep process, did it both ways. So my second chair lives in LA. So when we scrimmaged, he was still there, but then he came to Dallas and we competed that way. Actually found it pretty similar. There, other than him being there helped my sanity a lot and just like helped relax me as a person, having someone physically seated next to me. The trial part of it sort of was, went about the same way. One thing that I got told was, if the person is in the same room as you, it looks weird for you to be talking to them. You're allowed to talk to them as long as the rules are the same as they were for us. You can talk to them. There's nothing wrong with that. But it just looks weird when you're muted to see you like talking to somebody next to you. So just like be mindful of that. What was I going to say? Yeah, I think like when he was not with me, we were messaging on Zoom the whole time. So like, I had an impeachment coming up. So I was like, hey, I need you to get this ready for me. And that was fine. It's probably a little bit faster if they are in the same space as you. And the feedback issue was definitely a thing for us. We had to figure out how to make that work. We actually messed it up in the final round, of course. What the intention was to do was that my second chair's muted, camera off the whole time. If he ever needed to speak, like he introduced himself at the very beginning, he would turn his camera on, but not his audio. So his audio would be picked up through my computer. We were sitting right next to each other, but you would see him on the screen and see his lips moving. So that's what we did. I don't think there's like a huge difference one way or another. The difference was like me feeling better that I had somebody there with me.
If I could just, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Abby. No, please.
I could just say one thing about that. For TBC, Taylor and I were both in the same room while she was competing. The one thing I would say, if you're going to choose to do that, I don't know what the difference is. Our only experience was being in the same room. But if you do choose to be in the same room, and then if you're going to display a video, I would just say to practice that a lot ahead of time, because the sound on that, I believe the second chair's volume does have to be on, and that can create a weird feedback situation if two computers' volumes are on at the same time in the same room. So I would caution you to either maybe figure out being in a different room for that part of the trial, or just practicing it beforehand so you know how it sounds. That's my one piece of advice on that.
I agree with everything that's been said. I'll just say on behalf of Stand Up Mock Trial, the most important thing is socially distancing and following CDC guidelines. That's my non-liability speech. Okay. Our last question from the field, Cole Reese, returning Gladiator from Nevada. Cole, would you join us? Hey, Cole.
Hi, thanks for coming. I just wanted to ask really quickly if you guys had any tips for like looking at your camera screen as opposed to looking at an actual jury when you're giving like an open or close, just because I feel like that would be really weird to do.
Tom, and then Liz.
Yeah, Tom, go for it.
So again, test. It is weird, and little tiny things that you get away with in courtrooms are gone in this setting. If you are close up and you are looking at paper behind a computer, it's picked up. You may think you're clever. You may think that outline your second chair wrote for you and it's up on the wall and it's going to be a safety net for you isn't going to get picked up on. It gets picked up on. No, don't get me wrong. The benefit of that may outweigh the cost of you turning your head. That's a strategic question that you each have to make. But if you don't think that you sort of lightly looking up and to the left or the right isn't being picked up on, it is. So my advice is to really get, for example, your computer screen, and Liz and I were having a back and forth about this on chat here just a few minutes ago. Get your computer screen or whatever your camera is at the best angle you can to where it allows you to have essential eye contact without you having to look in some weird, unusual angle. And then be very cognizant of overdoing notes in room or things that can cause distraction. And I think Abby was just saying this, but the issues, for example, of whispering to a teammate, that same kind of distraction, when in a courtroom you can get away with it sometimes, it's so amplified here. And so the eye contact is just another example of that, where you can look really unfocused, you can look distracted, it can look like you are not sure of what's coming next, or it can just make your advocacy substantially weaker because you're lacking that eye contact that in front of a jury would be so compelling.
I echo everything that Tom said. And one of the big things, so I do almost like 4 to 5 daily webinars for government attorneys, et cetera, about how to adapt to this online hearing situation. And so Cole, I can tell you right now, just from even when you were talking and when you were listening to Tom, bless you, because you were respectful and you were looking at Tom on your computer screen. But I could see that you were looking at Thom as opposed to looking at me. And it's so weird because when you're looking at the video camera as opposed to anywhere else, like my normal reaction is like, I want to look at Thom and see what he's saying, but then it looks like I'm not paying attention. So you do need to be aware of that. And as Thom even previously mentioned with regard to any other thing about preparing and just making sure you're comfortable, record it. Like do these Zooms, record them, see what you think is going to look good, right? So if Cole, when you're looking at the video camera and you feel like, oh, that looks strange, and it's okay if I look at the actual computer, then you'll know that ahead of time, right? So those are some of the things that you can kind of catch up on ahead of time. The other big thing is, you know, brick and mortar courtroom. I always try to teach my students and my advocates and whoever I'm training, you know, you got to keep your poker face regardless, right? The bad thing about this whole Zoom life is when there are 4 pictures on the screen. Right now, you guys are not getting a true experience of this because I see a lot of black thumbnails with the names, right? So I don't see the necessarily like 4 video feeds on it. But when there are just 4 video feeds, man, my poker face is terrible. And I have to be aware of it even more so in an online format than I do in a brick and mortar courtroom, because when I'm live and in person, you know, the judge is a little further away than he is when he's seeing me, you know, zoomed in on just my face. So that's another thing that you really got to be aware of. Oh, sorry. Other camera angle thing. I have so many things about this. I was texting with Justin and Thom privately, like chatting with them. I'm literally on like 7 books. I'm on vacation in Nantucket. My New Hampshire friend who was on here, you know how beautiful it is here. But I don't necessarily have the best setup. So I had like 7 of my like novels that I've been reading this week underneath my computer. I can barely like chat on here because my computer is going to fall down if I do. But you want to make sure that your video camera angle is eye level. So like wherever your video camera is, if it's on the fold of your computer screen, wherever it is, you just want to make sure that it's eye level. And again, test it ahead of time, like record it and see if it's going to work.
Awesome.
Sorry.
No, that's great. Cole, thanks so much. So I'm going to ask a final question to each of our panelists. I'm going to start with Abby. Abby, we've been talking to you mostly about your work as a second chair, but I'm going to ask you what I think most people want to hear even more from you. How did you win Gladiator? I mean, you came to a tournament you'd never competed in before. Nobody from your school had ever competed in before, and you just ran through the field. You were first place after 2 rounds, and you just kept going. You just mowed people down. I know that you are very humble, but I want you to ditch that standard Abby humility for a minute and tell everybody what advice do you have?
Okay, so I guess I can only really speak to my experience from last year. But I would say just what I tried to focus on last year were probably 3 different things. So number 1, I would say to be prepared. You have, unlike Trial by Combat, unlike Top Gun, this is the only, you know, to my knowledge, one-on-one competition where you have a month to prepare leading up. So what I would say on be prepared is know your material, the material that you write, your statements, your examinations, but mostly know your case packet. Because there will be moments even in an online format where you get nervous and the memorization kind of goes, and you need to just be very familiar with the evidence, your case theory, just your case packet and your witness statements most of all. So I'd say be prepared. The second thing I would say is be reactive. I know my experience in high school was that it was a lot more scripted. Being in college, I have seen reactivity is really what makes the best competitors stand apart. And in a one-on-one format, you really have an opportunity. Your case packet is a lot smaller than I'm sure what your typical case packet is. So I would say take advantage of that fact and try to be reactive, you know, especially in closings, draw on the things that were said during the trial, react to opposing counsel's closing if you have that opportunity, and just be reactive. I think it not only sets you apart in a mock trial format, but it's great preparation for, I know a lot of us want to go into a legal career. So I think that's great preparation for that. And then the third piece of advice I would say is, it sounds silly, but just be yourself. Honestly, I think the best thing that helped me throughout Gladiator last year was just trying to be genuine and authentic. As a witness, that goes so far for your credibility and your believability, and that's, you know, majorly what you're scored on as a witness. And when you are authentic and you kind of own the bad parts of your statement, the judges will forgive some of the bad facts that you have. And then as an advocate, I think it's really important to be authentic and genuine as well. Like we were talking about earlier, if there's a technical difficulty, just take a moment to be human. I think judges, in my experience at least, they start to root for you when they see that you're human and you're likable and you're authentic. I think that goes a really long way, especially in a one-on-one competition. So that's the best advice I could offer for Gladiator.
Abby, that's awesome. Liz, I have a question for you. So we can get Liz back on screen. So Liz, you have coached in so many different formats, mock trial with teams, moot court competitions, and every one of them has their own set of rules. You've also done Top Gun a bunch. What have you seen that separates the best one-on-one competitors? And I guess this is a question not just for you to think about as competitors, but also what advice would you give to coaches that you've seen really separates the best one-on-one performances?
So I have to say, like, Abby almost said it best. So Abby, like, being yourself is huge, you guys. Like, I always joke that, like, I'm unapologetically me. I'm offensive at times. I'm charming at times, maybe, I hope. I am abrasive, but, like, I know who I am. And so it's hard, obviously, at a young age to know who we are. But, like, don't be anybody who you aren't. Like, when you step into a courtroom, be your best advocate. Like, be the person that's super enraged about the situation. And so, to be honest, like, Abby, like, what you said was awesome. And, like, even Justin, I don't know if you saw any of the speeches, for example, earlier. Sorry, y'all, that have nothing to do with this. But, like, for the melee thing, like, it's just, like, when I see people that are not being authentic, that's what drives me nuts. And I think that people can sniff that out a mile away. And even judges in these online competitions, I think, are going to equally be able to see that, you know, this person's turning into an actor on this video screen, and that's not what people want. You know, when I coach people in general and in life and in all of the competitions, I'm way too old, Justin, thanks for pointing that out. I've done way too many of these competitions. You know, what I've always tried to make sure that they're aware of is that they're still, you guys want to be lawyers, right? Like, we want to make sure that we are advocating for our clients. And that's the hardest thing to actually remember when we're doing these mock trials. Like, you got to keep in mind that, like, if you keep that passion in you that you guys all have that are driving you all as high school students to do this, keep the passion in you to make that argument strong. And to make sure that you, whatever side of the case that you're arguing, are doing the best for your clients. I feel like that's what's going to save the day.
Thanks, Liz. Tom, I'd like you to speak to the value of scrimmaging, because I know you talked about scrimmaging before. And I think some students are afraid of doing it because they don't want to give away their case secrets. What can you tell everybody about the value of scrimmaging and how you scrimmaged in the past?
So so it's interesting. As a coach, for example, at Stanford, we are notorious for our lack of attendance of tournaments, and that we don't go to very many invites. We don't scrimmage very often. I believe in the value of scrimmaging being in very particular moments. So you don't want to overdo it, for example, over and over and over again. But there's incredible value to getting to a place in your prep where you feel good and you feel like it's there and you've got the material, and it's then worthwhile to do a test that's far enough out from the competition that you've got time enough to iterate on all of the pieces and figure those components out. And we did that with TBC. With Gladiator, we did it, and with TBC, you had to do it with a whole different case. It's a train wreck and exhausting, and that means we all went through the effort of the 24-hour prep twice in something like a 3-week period, which Sonali can speak to. It was a brutal effort. In Gladiator, we did focused pieces of the case in scrimmage settings and with alums and other people from the team and whatnot who weren't competitors. What we did back then was we did a big scrimmage day about halfway through it, and we brought in alums from the program and other kids who were on the team, and they learned the parts and learned the roles. And so you weren't really giving anything up, but we relied on what was the program that had all of these other people, and we scored it. We brought in all of these external people, and we actually scored it, and we were then able to get that data out of it. And I think this speaks, Justin, if I can sort of twist off the question for a second, to what is a philosophy that I learned about these competitions with the checkbox structure from those scrimmages, which is about the importance of playing to the checkboxes. And that playing to the checkboxes as opposed to the normal scoring scale is a fundamentally different world. And so, you know, over the years of those rounds and making the final at Gladiator, we had a really good track record, for example, with my students with the exhibit checkmark. And that came from scrimmage after scrimmage after scrimmage of figuring out what actually got that checkmark and what was a trigger in a room to a scorer saying, that kid, that checkmark, it goes to them. And so the story I like to tell about this is Tiffany Tam, who won Gladiator one year. Tiffany was not always the most dynamic in a room every time, but when it came to exhibits, she would dramatically walk back to a table, pick it up, hold it above her head and be like, is it this exhibit you're talking about, sir? And then drop it back down as she passed it around. It was so over the top. But people constantly would say, I liked that Tiffany Tam girl. She really used those exhibits in these big ways. And that kind of a thing is about playing to checkboxes and understanding it. And I don't think we would have learned those kind of lessons without testing with scorers who were actually able to give us actual data that was actionable. So
that's great. I'm going to toss in one thought I have on scrimmages before I ask our last question, Sonali. I think that there is, in general, a desire or a fear of scrimmaging. I don't want everybody to see what we're doing. I don't want to see our material. If you're going to your very first online competition as a one-on-one competition, whatever value you think you have in your secret theory or your clever ideas, and they are surely good, the value in keeping those secret is not, in my view, as important as getting the practice and experience performing online, in Zoom, one-on-one, when you've never done it before. Watching this case tried, we saw variations of how people played the case. We saw bigger variations in how comfortable people were one-on-one and with the technology. So I would encourage people to scrimmage each other, especially now that you can scrimmage across the country using Zoom. All right, last question. This one's for Sonali. Sonali, I know that a lot of people come to this competition, must have some doubt in the back of their mind. It's scary to be competing one-on-one. I had a student tell me, I don't know if I can do this. Am I good enough? How do I know? Do you have any advice for folks in that position?
Yeah, I mean, I totally felt that way. I just wrote on Facebook about this. I almost didn't apply for TBC. I didn't think I was the best person at my school, let alone one of the best 16 people in the country. When I got the spot, so I ended up applying sort of on a whim. I said, like, I don't want to roll myself out. At least, like, I'll have other people, Justin can roll me out, and then at least I tried and I'll know. And then I got the spot. And honestly, part of my prep for the next month or so was convincing myself that I deserved it and I deserved to compete, and I earned my spot there, and that, I just needed to show up and do what I know how to do. And I mean, I think if you're feeling like that, you're totally not alone. I never, I didn't think I was going to get to compete at TBC, much less win it. It's hard. And honestly, if it is really something that's bothering you, like, you're anxious about it on a deep level like that, which it was for me, part of your prep and part of what you do to get ready for the tournament should be addressing that. Like, I talked to my team about it. It was stuff I had to do with myself just to work through that, so that when the moment came, I could be in the moment and really focus on competing. Yeah, I mean, it's hard, but the fact is, like, you got the spot. Like, you do get to compete for, like, wrong, right, better, worse. You have the opportunity. So now it's about what are you going to do with that? In high school, I did more speech and debate in high school, sorry, but something that somebody said to me before a national competition was, somebody has to win. Why can't it be you? And that really stuck with me. I thought about that going into TBC. Somebody's going to win, like, all you can do is do your best, work really hard. And if you have this stuff in your head about, do I deserve to be here? Did I earn it? You're not going to do your best. So I know it's hard. Believe me, I totally feel that. I really had imposter syndrome about competing at TBC, but you have to do your best to push it out of your head and just make the best with the opportunity that you were given.
Sonali, thanks for sharing that. I want to thank our panelists. Sonali, we're thrilled to have you on after your championship. Thom, thank you for your help you're going to give us in the tab room. Liz, a couple people have reached out to me and said, hey, how do we get in contact with Liz and her company TACT? shoot me an email, and I'm happy to put you guys in touch. And Abby, I look forward to seeing your application to UCLA Law in just a couple of years. I couldn't help myself.
I want Abby at Temple. Okay, number one. Number two.
All right.
I'm honored.
Once I'm back to reality after vacation time, I'm all yours.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.
Justin.
Thank you, Justin.
Good luck.
Thank you.